Are you ultimately doing a video post, or you just use it a written piece?
It's video.
Oh, it is. Okay.
You gotta look at my website where I have 155 episodes with all the leading documentary filmmakers. Today we have Jeff Zimbalist and his film How to Come Alive with Norman Mailer. It's a spectacular biography of one of the best-selling writers of all time. He's a man who had 6 wives and 9 children and 11 bestsellers, 3 arrests, and 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So let's take a look at the trailer.
Ladies and gentlemen, Norman Mailer.
Mr. Norman Mailer.
Norman Mailer is among the most celebrated authors of the century, and undoubtedly the most controversial.
No other writer compares to the range and rigor of his writing. 30 books over 6 decades, a National Book Award, 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
There's a certain passion that is dying in American life, a pervasive distaste for bitter argument, for controversy. People are becoming less and less interested in looking at ugly problems and debating questions that are not quickly answered. A sense of light diminishes in all of us, which I think is the modern disease. You see that we're all becoming duller, more conventional, more unimaginative.
Technology drives us further and further away from our instincts.
And we're flattening out people's spirits.
Today we have a filmmaker named Jeff Zimbalist and his film about Norman Mailer, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I'd like to remind you that we're brought to you by Real Screen. Real Screen Summit's coming up in Miami. If you are a filmmaker, this is the place you want to be, because many of the top executives from the major networks are there. There are all kinds of programs about buying and selling. You'll meet a lot of people. I've been going there for 20 years. Check out at the bottom of the Westdoc web page. There's a link to all the information you'll need. So now let's say hi to Jeff. How are you, Jeff?
Hi, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I always like to ask first, where are you speaking from?
Speaking from my office in Hollywood, Los Angeles, California.
I know it well.
Heard of it?
Well, where are you from? Are you from LA or are you from somewhere
No,
else?
I grew up in Western Mass, foothills of the Berkshires, 5 College area. My dad's a professor and a Latin Americanist and economist. So I was raised on an all-women's college campus, Smith College.
Well, was that good or was that not
it
so good?
Taught me things earlier than others, which can be good and bad. But I still had the normal college experience myself. I went to Brown in Providence, Rhode Island, and lived in New York for over a decade. Lived in the Bay Area for 5 years, and then have lived in LA now for about 12 years. And during that time, I've traveled most of every year on projects internationally, a lot to Latin America.
Well, I noticed that in your credits. And, one of your early notoriously famous films is Favela Rising. I happen to have been in Rio and got the touristy tour of the favelas, and while I was doing a project down there, and I loved Rio. I haven't seen Favela Rising, but I watched the trailer today, and it looked pretty scary, and so I don't know. I was there in 2005. When did you make your film?
Yeah, we were living there in 2005. The film came out in 2006. The awards campaign was 2007, but I was there from 2002 to 2005, living in Rio. And during that time, spending many days and even some nights in Vigario Geral, which was the favela that we were focused on. At that stage of my career, I was doing a lot of conflict journalism, embedding in war zones, making my mom very scared. Partly because of her fear and anxiety, I started moving out of that as I made my sort of third, fourth film. And then I went back into a conflict area, combat zone for Give Us This Day, where we lived and documented in East St. Louis, the conflict between teenage drug traffickers and police. So Yeah, I think the adrenaline and the edginess and the existential experience of being in a place with that much sorrow and that much ecstasy all in one has always appealed to me. But, um, you know, my life has evolved and my career has evolved to safer places.
And you'll see as you get older, you might like the safer places a little better. And
I mean,
which was more dangerous in your mind, East St. Louis or the favelas?
you know, the favelas both were very dangerous in tangible, literal ways. I mean, you've got teenagers with guns who are unsophisticated and trigger happy, and you need to avoid the bullet. I would say the most fear I ever felt on a project was the Two Escobars, which was my second feature-length doc, which we made in Medellin, Colombia, and it was one of the first, if not the first, doc after the reign of the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar to really dig into the inner workings of his cartel. And many people were really threatened by that investigation. And so there's this thing called the mano negra, which is the black hand, which means that you may not know that you're being surveilled, but you could flag a taxi and inside could be a hired hitman, and that's the last people will see of you. And so there was this fear in my imagination of the worst case scenario, which I found to be much more frightening than the literal. Compare it to Edgar Allan Poe versus Stephen King, where Stephen King will give you the graphic details of the murder. Edgar Allan Poe will leave you in this, corner and drop a torch in, and then that's the end of the story, and the rest of it's left up to your imagination. I would have nightmares for weeks after reading Poe, and not after reading Stephen King. So, I think fear in the imagination goes a lot further than in the literal.
You speak Portuguese?
Yeah, I speak more of a Portuñol. I learned Spanish well before Portuguese, so when I speak in
But they're so
Brazil,
different, is not
I do a mix. Yeah.
I mean, Spanish I can kind of understand,
Uh-huh.
some, but when I was in Brazil, there's hardly a syllable that makes any sense, I think, in Portuguese.
Yeah, the roots are really similar. It's about adapting to the accent.
What is your background in getting into film? How did you start becoming a filmmaker? Were you through school or through experience?
Yeah, I think my parents mostly. My mom's an artist and a therapist, and my dad had lived and worked in shifting regimes in Latin America for many, many years. He worked under Fidel Castro in Cuba. He worked under Noriega in Panama, and he was working under Allende in Chile in the early 1970s, and got a call 2 days before the military coup, Pinochet, U.S.-backed Pinochet coup, from a State Department friend who told him to get out of the country, and he did the day before they raided his apartment and his office. So I was raised hearing his adventure stories in Latin America, and on the forefront, the cutting edge of regime changes, and hearing my mom's psychological analyses of people's life choices and making art. So I think it was a combination of all three of those things that led me to this medium and wanting to tell stories. And I've always been drawn to, the unknown. I sort of subscribe to the philosophy that the less you know about a place, the more you'll learn about yourself. And so I do often push myself to engage with and embed inside subcultures that I know nothing about. If a project scares me and intimidates me in the beginning, that's a good thing. It means I'm going to grow through the process. And so that's often a criteria for choosing films.
What was your father doing in Cuba and these other places, if I may ask?
Well, so he was an economist, and he was studying how efficiency was actually higher in obrero-led workplaces. So when the workers were their own bosses, he was able to statistically show that efficiency was up. And that kind of a study was very supportive of Allende government, a socialist system. My father was sort of providing proof that this was the future. And of course, it was during the Cold War, and a time when there was an enormous amount of pressure to undermine these systems, and that's what led to the U.S.-backed coup.
Boy, it sounds like there's a couple of more documentaries just
There's
there, right?
an interesting side story here, Chuck, since we're going down this rabbit hole, is that my father was working with a journalist who was a friend of his, and they shared an office, who was an American in 1973 in Santiago, Chile, and he did not leave, and he was captured in the raid of the office, brought to the National Stadium with Victor Jara and all these other political prisoners, and he was killed there. And his wife and her family were deep in Washington, D.C. politics and conducted their own investigation into why the U.S. had not come forward with their involvement in the coup and why they hadn't warned the Americans that were down there. And Costa Gavras, who's famous for his film Z, made a film called Missing about this gentleman that my dad was friends with, and it went on to win an Oscar and reveal the U.S. involvement in the coup down there. So it has been told, the story's been told, and it resonated.
So you're in a really unusual position right now, I would say, having two major documentaries that sort of released about the same time. Is there any connection between them beside the fact that you're the producer and director? I mean, the same studios or totally different projects just happen to be coming out now? Or
Totally different. Yeah, I mean, they're both independently financed, but they're on the opposite side of the independent release spectrum. I mean, one of them, the How to Come Alive with Norman Mailer film, was released by Kino Lorber's Zeitgeist in art houses like Film Forum in New York and Laemmle in LA, at the same time that Skywalkers was released in IMAX and Netflix. And it's very rare, I think, to have two films released on the same day by such opposite independent distribution strategies. So it's an interesting case study in what works and what doesn't work, and what kind of attention you get in today's, quickly evolving marketplace for documentaries. I would say what's similar about them is more thematic, that they both, in their own way, investigate how we negotiate fear, risk, and courage. With the Norman Mailer one, it's very much about how we do that cerebrally, like how we think about putting ourselves out there into the world, and how afraid or courageous we are when contemplating the reactions of others. How big of a role does that play in our choices? And with Skywalkers, it's physical. It's will I fall from this height? And in both cases, we tried to make those universal questions so the viewer is asking him or herself while watching the film what their own threshold for fear and courage is.
Norman Mailer, who had, 6 marriages, 9 children, 11 bestsellers, 3 arrests, and 2 Pulitzer Prizes. What a life. How do you, he's a notorious figure. There's no shortage of video on him because he seemed to take advantage of every opportunity to be on camera. And on the one hand, he's this best-selling author, one of the best-selling authors of all time, with tremendous ideas. How do you even start and structure a film like a biopic on Norman Mailer?
Yeah, I mean, I was already into Mailer because, I had sort of the nice Jewish boy upbringing by first generation Jewish immigrant relatives living in New York who became artists and intellectuals and survived the Holocaust. So we had a lot in common. And, I was sort of a young storyteller in my teens, and here comes this tough love, writer who says that you have to be unabashed with your creativity, that the only way to really start to understand the human condition and explore your creative capacity is to be less afraid of the response. And I responded to that kind of tough love push at that time in my life. Flash forward 20 years, and his family, his kids, were looking to do a doc that would release on his centennial, what would have been his 100th birthday. And I had a conversation with them in which we agreed that his ideas were prophetic and that they were more relevant than ever today. But also I'm on the phone with the family, and I've had that experience before where the estate of somebody says they want to make a doc, and the next thing you know, you're being pressured to make a hagiography and just celebrate the person. And so I was very forward, along with Stu Schreiberg, the executive producer on the film. I was very forward in saying that this needs to equally investigate Mailer's flaws and his mistakes and his massive ego. He is not just a role model. And it needs to be mixed bag, warts and all. You don't have to love Mailer to be ignited by his mind and his ideas, and you don't have to hate Mailer to learn from his mistakes. And so rather than focus on sort of his enduring legacy and doing a survey of all of his works, I'd be much more interested in using Mailer as a vessel to explore a theme. And the theme at the time that I was already interested in is this love-hate relationship that we have as a country with complex, provocative ideas. And so I was pitching to them a complex, provocative portrait. Often when I do that with the family of somebody, you get crickets on the other end of the call. But in this case, John Buffalo Mailer and Danielle Mailer responded immediately. Yeah, that's what Dad would have wanted. He would have wanted for us to expose him in all of his tragic ways. And why don't we just come out and start the film with the stabbing? He stabbed his second wife, Adele, and the person who said that on the call was Danielle, his daughter, who was in the house when Norman stabbed Adele. And so for her, despite the trauma that something like that, I can't even begin to imagine, creates in someone, she was willing and able to sort of harness or in some way channel her dad's courage and say, yeah, let's start right out the gates with that. And of course, that was the sensibility that I liked, and we were sort of locked at the hip, and the family and I, in our approach. Over time, we did start the film with the stabbing, by the way, but over time, we started to look for structures that weren't comprehensive cradle to grave biopics and chronology. And one of the things that came to me was that he had all these rules for how to come alive, and that we could structure his life and track his evolution from the nice Jewish boy into the combative boxer, brash, ego, violent, celebrating, instigator, provocateur, agitator, and then back into some of that softening into the nice Jewish boy again. We could track all of that through his rules to come alive, because despite how many different masks and personas and identities he wills himself to become in his life, the constant is that the fire never went away. He found a way to stay ignited, and that felt like a beautiful message in a balanced piece about him, that we need to find for ourselves what it is that makes us come alive, because what the world needs is for more people to come alive.
What was the reaction when the 106 relatives at the end of the day saw the show?
It's an intimidating crowd because they're all so accomplished, and some of them are filmmakers. I mean, Michael Mailer is a very accomplished filmmaker. Obviously, John Buffalo's been in a lot of films. Kate's been in a ton of films. So I was intimidated, but the response was amazing. They embraced some of the more risky choices that we made, and have now been touring with the film. The nice thing about having 9 children is any city in the country you release the film, you've got a Q&A with one of the Mailer children. So they've done more Q&As now than I have, and it's great. It brings people out all over the country, and Kino Lorber and Zeitgeist have been booking it in all sorts of art houses, and I just hear about it the next day, see photos online, and one Mailer or another's always there.
And what's the distribution plan after theatrical? Can you...
Yeah, in September, in about a month, it'll be released both on DVD and on Apple TV and on Amazon and on demand. And then we are currently negotiating international release of the film. We won an IDA award, we were nominated for an IDA award, and we've won a number of film festival awards. So The film has generated momentum despite, being a smaller art house release, which is really flattering.
I must say, it's visually stunning. You don't think of a film about a writer as being having these great visual montages and some great action scenes and some great conflict. It really works on so many different levels. And I learned quite a bit about Mailer that I didn't know or had forgotten, or he's what a fascinating character. How did the film get financed? And can you talk
Yeah,
about the budget a little bit?
sure. Yeah. Before I do, I want to just give some credit to Vicky Marquette, my producer, and Alana Burns, my editor on the film. And I should say Jacques as well, our composer. I mean, we really made a concerted effort to break rules and break convention and be weird was the word we used a lot in the edit process, partly to try to channel some of Mailer's own aesthetic choices to push boundaries. Obviously, we wanted it to reach as wide an audience as possible, and we wanted to keep the storytelling at a quick clip and structurally have it be accessible. But in terms of the aesthetic, we really took some risks, like using fireworks and flowers blooming as metaphors for, murder and creativity and sublimation of base instincts, and going deep into some of the conversations about drugs. And so it was a lot of fun to really sort of look at rough cuts and have my notes. Instead of saying this is too avant-garde, I was saying just go weirder, be weirder. That's too conventional. Mailer wouldn't approve. It was a really fun process, and it was great that there was so much archive to work with. Yeah, the film was initially financed by Vinny Malhotra from Showtime, and in the consolidation of Showtime with Paramount Plus, CBS. At that point, the rights reverted to us, and we were able to then, we had just finished the film, luckily, so the timing worked out, and we were able to then go out and sell it for theatrical distribution. And I don't believe that the budget is public, unfortunately, but it was a low budget, independent budget, low budget independent number. Yeah.
Can you go into a little more detail? How did it work with Showtime sort of shutting down their doc department? Did they didn't just hand you the film? You have to, whatever money you got, you have to pay back, the budget, or was there some kind of a deal, a special deal that worked to your favor, or how did that work?
I don't know the details of it. I actually was not at the front lines of that process. It did take a while, which delayed the release of the film, but ultimately I feel really grateful and lucky, blessed that we were able to go resell the film without a lien. We did not need to pay back the budget to make the film. So, fortunately, I think other projects probably were at a different stage of production and then had to go out and find finishing funds. Fortunately, we had just finished, which meant that we essentially could just go shop it around, and that we could do something that's financially higher risk in terms of a art house theatrical release. So it ended up being perfect for the film. We always everything I do, I mix and color and design for the theatrical experience, even if it's a straight to streamer thing. You never know who's watching it in a home theater and has 5.1 sound and has the big projector. And so, the film was built for a theatrical environment, and it's wonderful that the feedback we've gotten is that even though it's a film about ideas and complexity, that it plays as a spectacle at times. And like you said, it generates action sequences. And so it's very fulfilling that it can be a widely accessible theatrical experience.
It really does work as a film, and on the surface, on the surface, it's a biography about a writer, and you think, oh,
Right.
well, I don't know, it doesn't sound that exciting, and it really is exciting. There's so much going on in the film. Let's
Thank you. I appreciate that. We try to make things compact and layered and create forward movement. I've always, no matter what the subject is, if it's about an extreme sport like Skywalkers, or it's about ideas and a guy sitting in his studio thinking, like it has to generate momentum and emotion at the base of it all.
Let's talk about Skywalker, a love story. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about and what's the story behind that film?
Yeah, so I was a amateur but passionate rooftopper when I was in my teens and early 20s, which was late 90s, early aughts. And, I was drawn to it for a lot of the same reasons that others, including the subjects of the film, were. Is this sort of sense that when living in a big city, you're in a culture bubble that defines all of your activities and your destinations, and everything feels like you're conforming to some sort of advertisement or peer pressure. And sort of to find oneself, you need to go into the unknown, into these undefined autonomous spaces. And that meant trespassing. That meant, finding the nooks and the crannies under the city or the roofs on top of it where I could face my fear on my own terms and figure out who I wanted to be on my own terms. And I think I mentioned it earlier. I mean, that's a philosophy of life I take into choosing projects, is the less I know about a space, the more I learn about myself. And so, um, I did it, but didn't know it had a name. I just called it trespassing. And then once I sort of took off my proverbial balaclava and put on my journalism cap in the early 2000s, I learned that others were doing this activity all over the world and trespassing onto the roofs of the highest buildings in their cities and doing acrobatic stunts and shooting it with GoPros and drones, and that it was called rooftoping. And so I set out to find a story in that world that would resonate as deeply as my experience had. And it was tough because mostly what I found was daredevils dangling, risking their lives for likes on social media, which didn't interest me. It felt very superficial. And it wasn't until 2015 when Angela Nicolau burst on the scene, first female rooftopper. She's uh, says she doesn't want to compete with the guys. She wants to do it her own way and seeing it through a feminine lens. She really was making images that were different. She was focusing on her wardrobe and the lighting and the composition. And she was bringing in acrobatics and gymnastics and talking about how her influences were Jean-Michel Basquiat and Warhol, and not, the Kardashians or Jake Paul. And so, I said, oh my God, this is a real artist. I was intrigued. I reached out to her. And in our first conversation, she told me she was raised in a traveling Russian circus and learned to work with animals and do trapeze at a young age. I thought, well, that's even more intriguing. And she considered what she did the modern day version of a traveling circus, evolving from what her parents did to what a contemporary audience would understand as an artistic performance. And then she introduced me to Vanya, who at the time was probably the most popular Russian rooftopper, but they talked about each other as rivals or competitors. And you could sense under the surface there was a bubbling flirtation between the two. And they maybe just hadn't become comfortable enough to go public with their relationship. And that's where the seed got planted of, maybe this is potentially a love story on top of the world, and we can use extreme climbing as a metaphor for romantic trust.
Security always has a blind spot, but prisons here are hardcore.
We're so far from who we used to be.
Ты куда хватаешься вообще?
Мне не надо говорить, что мне надо, что мне не надо.
This climb was supposed to bring us back together.
If Vanya stumbles, I fall into the abyss. Of course, I'm afraid to die.
High liability, a lot of risk, a lot of danger, but they believed in me and they believed in the film. And I hired a crew, some of which included Russian Americans like Maria Bukhanina, who could be in Russia during the pandemic and during the Russian invasion of Ukraine when I couldn't be there, and then went out and lived in Asia for a few years and followed these characters not knowing what the finish line would be. Like a classic cinema verite follow doc, you don't know what your climax is. And having independent finance allowed us to be patient and let it evolve before our eyes. I talked in Mailer about sort of finding that nugget or that North Star. And with Skywalkers, it pulled us in a lot of different directions. Sometimes with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it felt like it wanted to be more political. And other times with the big climactic trespassing scene, it felt like a ninja mission. It wanted to be a heist film, and sometimes it felt like it wanted to be a thriller. And we just had to keep reminding ourselves throughout the process, and especially in the edit, that this was not a film about the fear of falling from heights, that this was ultimately a film about the fear of falling in love, and just kept bringing ourselves back to this is a love story. And I really feel like that created the structure, the container that allowed us to stay focused and singular for 7 years.
I think it's somewhat ironic that we're having this conversation this week, because the show that I did just before this show was a meditation on mortality called I Like It Here, with a great filmmaker named Ralph Arlick, whose film is really about how do you face the end as you get older in a productive, positive way. And here, your film about Mailer is all about living the life that you have. So the theme sort of in the last couple of shows is about life and death, more life, hopefully.
Yeah, I think pushing through fear, sort of our greatest potential is on the other side of fear, is a common theme in both Skywalkers and in Mailer. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about Remastered at Netflix. Tell me a little bit about that series and your involvement in some of the shows. I'm especially interested in Sam Cooke, for whatever
Yeah,
reason.
that was a really great experience. My brother and I had done a lot of 30 for 30s for ESPN, which of course is an anthology sports series. And we felt like we should create a parallel series that would be an anthology music series. And we took the angle of untold stories in the world of music, and particularly investigations.
There was a sense in the music industry that Sam was getting too powerful.
Who would want to shoot Sam Cooke?
There are a lot of people who believe that there was some sort of cover-up.
People deeply felt that the FBI was somehow involved.
When I found out Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali, and Malcolm X were all connected, I said, what a huge threat to America.
We were able to get the support of Irving Azoff, who's a music mogul, and the support of Netflix. And we went out and put a really stellar team together with, Oscar-winning directors like Barbara Koppel and a bunch of Emmy winners and Sundance winners, and set out to investigate something like 16 different stories, which then, through our investigation led to a choice of 8, and 8 films were made under the Remastered banner. And each one was, a different country, a different time period, and a different look at music through a new lens. The release of Skywalkers and the release of Mailer could not be more opposite. It's like opposite ends of the spectrum. I don't know that there's been a filmmaker prior to this who's had one film released in Film Forum in Laemmle at the same day as another film released on IMAX and Netflix at the exact same time. They're both independently financed feature documentaries, but one of them was on the most commercial end of the spectrum for the distribution mechanisms, and the other on the most art house. And it's just been an interesting case study to see what kind of press it's generated, what kind of attention they've generated. We're now with Skywalkers, we're top 10 in over 60 countries around the world. I mean, the viewership numbers are mind-blowing, how many people have watched it and how viral it's gone. And at the same time, it feels so satisfying when, you sell out a 200-person art house cinema with the Mailer film. So it's an evolving moment in the documentary and the nonfiction marketplace. And I feel really blessed to have been able to watch these two films engage with those shifting rules in different ways, and know that both options are still alive and kicking.
What project are you working on next?
Well, we have a couple of things that are sort of evolutions or spin-offs of the Skywalkers theme that I'm really excited about, including a scripted version. And then I've got a couple other things that I'm excited about in the world of music that I will be announcing in the coming months. But at the moment, I'm very much enjoying some downtime. Often as an independent, production company at All Rise Films, my company, we go right from finishing one thing into the middle of the next one, and there's this constant stagger. But when things align so that you can release a bunch of stuff at the same time, it's great to get a little downtime and really engage with the development of new ideas. That's the most fun process, to live a life of the mind for a few months and read and write and watch stuff. We just also had we won 2 Emmys for Super League, the War for Football, which we did with Apple. And we got an Emmy nomination for Crush, which we did with Paramount Plus. So it feels very climactic at the moment, and that buys my restless mind a couple of months to relax and engage with things on a more patient level. So you'll soon find out, Chuck.
I want to thank you so much for being on Westdoc. It really was great having you on, and I wish you the best of luck in the future.
Thank you so much, Chuck. It was a pleasure. It was great talking with you.